The logbook was supposed to be a record of every patrol, every incident, every door checked, and every anomaly noted during the overnight shift. The previous guard had kept it meticulously. Neat handwriting, timestamps down to the minute, initials at the end of every entry. The last official entry was dated September 14th, the night before he was terminated. But when I flipped forward through the pages on my second week, I found another entry in the same handwriting, dated September 29th, 2 weeks after he'd been fired. And it read, simply, checked all posts, building secure. R.H. My name is Nate. In the fall of 2023, I was 34 years old and working overnight security at Northgate Industrial Park in Bangor, Maine. I'd done 4 years in the Marines, 2 deployments, and come home to a state where the job market for guys with my particular skill set was limited to either law enforcement or private security. I didn't want to be a cop. I'd seen enough of what happens when you give people authority without accountability, and I didn't trust myself not to become the thing I hated. So I took the security gig. It paid $17 an hour, which in Bangor was enough to cover rent on a 1-bedroom apartment on Ohio Street and keep gas in my truck and food in the fridge. It wasn't glamorous. It was honest, and it was quiet. And after 2 deployments, I had learned to value quiet above almost everything else. Bangor is a small city that feels smaller at night. Once you get past the strip of chain restaurants on Hogan Road and the cluster of businesses around the mall, it gets dark and quiet fast. The Penobscot River runs through the middle of everything, and on still nights you can hear it from blocks away, this low, constant murmur like the city is breathing in its sleep. Stephen King set half his books here, and I understand why. There's something about the architecture, the old brick mills, the Victorian houses on the side streets, the way the fog comes off the river in October, that makes you feel like the town is holding secrets in its walls. Northgate Industrial Park sat on the north side of the Penobscot River, about a mile past the Hollywood Casino. It was a complex of 4 buildings that had originally been part of the Eastern Manufacturing Company, a paper mill that had operated from the early 1900s until it shut down in the 1980s. The buildings had been gutted and renovated in stages over the years. Building A was office space, mostly occupied by a regional insurance company and a few small tech firms. Building B was light industrial, machine shops and fabrication outfits. Building C was cold storage, leased by a food distribution company. And Building D was the oldest structure on the property, a 3-story brick mill building that had been only partially renovated and was used primarily for overflow storage by tenants who needed cheap square footage and didn't mind the lack of climate control. The overnight shift was 10 to 6, same as most security gigs. I was the only guard on duty. During the day, there was a 2-man team that covered the property, but the overnight budget only allowed for 1 person. My responsibilities were straightforward. I sat in the security office in Building A, monitored a bank of 12 camera feeds, and did 3 walking patrols per shift, 1 at midnight, 1 at 2:30, and 1 at 5. Each patrol followed a specific route through all 4 buildings, checking exterior doors, loading docks, and interior corridors. The route had been designed by the previous overnight guard, a man named Roy Haskell, who had held the position for nearly 3 years before being fired for sleeping on duty. I never met Roy. He was gone before I started, but his presence was everywhere in that job. His patrol route was still the one I followed. His logbook was the one I wrote in. His coffee mug, a faded blue ceramic thing with the Marines logo on it, was still in the security office kitchen. When I mentioned it to Dale, the daytime supervisor, he laughed and said Roy was Army, not Marines, and that the mug had been there before Roy started and would probably be there long after I left too. But the logbook was definitely Roy's. His handwriting was distinctive, small and precise, every letter formed with the deliberate care of someone who believed that documentation mattered. The September 29th entry bothered me. I showed it to Dale the next morning. He looked at it for a long time, then said it was probably just a page Roy had filled out before he was fired and misdated by accident. People make mistakes with dates all the time. I nodded and let it go, but the entry wasn't misdated. It referenced specific conditions: temperature 41 degrees, light rain, loading dock B2 secured, after wind blew it open. The weather on September 29th had in fact been 41 degrees with light rain. I checked. Roy Haskell had been in this building 2 weeks after his termination, writing in the security logbook like he still worked here. I changed the lock on the security office the next day. I paid for it myself, a $40 deadbolt from the Lowe's on Stillwater Avenue, because I knew if I submitted a maintenance request, it would take 2 weeks and involve 3 emails and a form. I installed it during my shift and kept both keys. Dale noticed the next morning and raised an eyebrow, but didn't object. I think he understood. The following week, I started finding things. The first was a cigarette butt in the stairwell between the 2nd and 3rd floors of Building D. It was a camel blue, smoked down to the filter and crushed on the concrete step. Building D had no tenants who worked past 6 in the evening, and the stairwell was locked from the outside. You needed a key to get in. I picked up the butt with a paper towel and put it in a plastic bag. I didn't know why I did that. Some part of the Marine in me that still collected evidence first and asked questions later. 3 nights later, I found another one. Same stairwell, same brand, same step. This time, the ash was fresh enough that I could smell it. Someone had been standing in the stairwell, smoking within the last hour. I had done my midnight patrol 45 minutes earlier and walked right past that stairwell door without checking it because it was locked from the outside and I had no reason to believe anyone was inside. I started checking it. Every patrol, I unlocked the stairwell door in Building D and walked all 3 flights, top to bottom. On the 4th night of checking, I found the door to the basement level propped open with a brick. The basement of Building D was a sprawling, unfinished concrete space that ran the full footprint of the building. It was used for mechanical equipment, electrical panels, and the old boiler system that had been decommissioned when the building was renovated. It was also the one part of the property that had no camera coverage. I stood at the top of those basement stairs for a full minute before I went down. Not because I was scared. I'd cleared buildings in Helmand Province that were rigged with actual explosives. A boiler room in Maine was not going to break me. But there's a difference between training and instinct, and my instinct was telling me that whatever was at the bottom of those stairs was something I wasn't going to be able to unsee. I went down anyway. I had a Streamlight flashlight, the kind that throws a beam you can read by from 50 feet. The basement was cold and damp, the air thick with the mineral smell of old concrete and standing water. The boiler room was at the far end, behind a heavy steel fire door that was supposed to be padlocked. The padlock was hanging open. Inside the boiler room, behind the decommissioned furnace, I found a camp cot with a sleeping bag, a plastic storage bin containing canned food and bottles of water, a battery-powered lantern, and a small pile of camel blue cigarette butts on the floor beside the cot. Someone was living in the basement of Building D. The sleeping bag was unzipped and pushed to one side, like someone had gotten out of it in a hurry or just hadn't bothered to straighten it. The canned food was generic brand, the kind you buy at the dollar store: baked beans, corn, Vienna sausages. There was a can opener beside the bin and a plastic fork with dried food on the tines. Whoever was staying here wasn't just passing through. They had set up a life down here, minimal and hidden and organized with the efficiency of someone who had done this before or who had learned to live small out of necessity. I backed out of the boiler room and locked the stairwell behind me. I went to the security office and pulled up every camera feed on the property, scanning each one methodically, looking for anything out of place. All exterior doors appeared secure. The parking lots were empty except for my truck and the food distribution company's refrigerated trailers in the Building C lot. I saw nothing. But when I checked the parking lot camera archive from earlier that evening, I found something. At 9:47, 13 minutes before my shift started, a dark-colored pickup truck had pulled into the far corner of the Building D lot, beyond the reach of the overhead lights. The driver had killed the headlights before turning in. The truck sat there for approximately 4 minutes, then the driver's door opened and a figure got out, moved toward Building D, and disappeared around the corner of the building where there was no camera coverage. The truck remained in the lot until 4:12 in the morning, when the figure returned, got in, and drove away with the headlights off until reaching the main road. I couldn't see the license plate. The camera resolution was too low, and the truck was too far from the light. But I could see enough to know that the truck was an older model, mid-2000s, possibly a Ford or Chevy, with what appeared to be a toolbox mounted in the bed. Dale confirmed what I already suspected. Roy Haskell drove a 2004 Ford F-150 with an aftermarket toolbox, dark green. Dale had seen it in the parking lot almost every day for 3 years. Roy had been the overnight guard. He had designed the patrol route. He knew every camera angle, every blind spot, every unlocked door, and every door that could be propped open without triggering an alarm. He knew when the midnight patrol would reach Building D and how long it took to walk the route. He had built the system, and now he was using his knowledge of it to come and go without being detected. I called the Bangor Police Department the next morning. An officer named Pelletier came out and took my statement. He was polite, but clearly skeptical. A former security guard sleeping in a boiler room wasn't exactly a high-priority case. He said he'd run Roy's name and see if there were any outstanding warrants. There weren't. Pelletier said he'd increase patrols in the area, but couldn't do much else without catching Roy in the act. That night, I sat in the security office and thought about Roy Haskell the way I used to think about hostile positions in Afghanistan. I mapped out everything I knew. He had 3 years of institutional knowledge about this property. He knew the camera positions, the patrol timing, the door hardware, the alarm configurations. He knew which lights were on timers and which ones were manual. He knew which parts of Building D had no camera coverage and which exterior doors had latches that didn't seat properly in cold weather. I was fighting on his terrain, using his playbook, and he had the advantage of having written the rules. So I changed the patrol route. Every night I randomized it. I'd start at Building C instead of Building A, or skip Building B on the midnight patrol, and double back at 1:30. I varied my timing by 10 to 15 minutes in either direction. I stopped using the same stairwells and started entering buildings from different doors. I wanted Roy to be unable to predict where I'd be at any given moment. On the 5th night of the new randomized route, I was doing a 2:15 patrol of Building D when I heard footsteps on the floor above me. I was on the 1st floor. The footsteps were on the 2nd, moving from the south end of the building toward the north stairwell. They were unhurried, confident, the footsteps of someone who knew the building by heart and had no reason to think anyone was listening. I pressed myself against the wall and controlled my breathing the way I'd been trained. Slow inhale through the nose, slow exhale through the mouth, keeping my heart rate down so I could hear clearly. The footsteps were steady and even, no hesitation, no pausing to listen. This was a person who walked this building the way I walked my own apartment. I radioed Bangor PD from my cell phone, keeping my voice low. Then I moved to the north stairwell and positioned myself at the bottom of the stairs, my flashlight off, standing in the dark. The footsteps reached the stairwell door above me. I heard it open. I heard boots on the metal stairs, descending, one flight, then another. The boots reached the ground floor landing. I turned on my flashlight. Roy Haskell was a small man, 5'7", maybe 160. He had a weathered face and thinning gray hair, and was wearing a canvas work jacket and steel-toed boots. He was carrying a canvas duffel bag over one shoulder. He didn't run. He didn't even flinch at the light. He squinted at me for a moment, then said, in a voice that was remarkably calm, "You must be the new guy." I told him to put the bag down. He did. I told him the police were on their way. He nodded. Then he sat down on the bottom step, pulled a pack of Camel Blues from his jacket pocket, and asked if I minded if he smoked while we waited. I told him I did mind. He put the cigarettes away. The Bangor police arrived in 8 minutes. Roy cooperated fully. The duffel bag contained copper wire, approximately 40 pounds of it, stripped and coiled. He had been systematically removing copper from the decommissioned heating system in Building D's basement over a period of several weeks, stockpiling it and driving it to a scrap dealer in Old Town. At scrap prices, the copper was worth somewhere between $800 and $1,200. He had risked a breaking and entering charge for what amounted to about 2 months of grocery money. The Bangor police booked Roy at the Penobscot County Jail on Main Street. I gave my statement at the station and drove home as the sun was coming up over the river, the October light turning the water this flat silver color that made the whole city look like a photograph someone had left out in the rain. I sat in my truck in the driveway for 20 minutes before going inside. I wasn't shaken. I was tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. Roy was charged with criminal trespass and theft. He pleaded guilty and received 6 months of probation and a restitution order for the value of the stolen copper and the cost of replacing the locks he had compromised. I learned later from Dale that Roy had lost his apartment after being fired and had been living out of his truck and occasionally in the Building D basement. He hadn't been sleeping there every night, just on the coldest ones, when the truck cab wasn't enough to keep the Maine October from getting through the windows. He had a storage unit on Union Street where he kept most of his belongings. He ate at the Salvation Army on weekday afternoons. He had applied for 6 jobs in the 2 weeks after being fired and hadn't heard back from any of them. The copper was supposed to cover his truck insurance payment so he wouldn't lose the only shelter he had left. I don't tell this story because Roy Haskell was dangerous. He wasn't. He was a man who had spent 3 years protecting a building, and then, when the building stopped paying him, couldn't bring himself to leave it entirely. What makes this story worth telling is what it taught me about security as a concept. Roy knew my job better than I did because he had done it first. He knew where the cameras pointed and where they didn't. He knew which doors had weak latches and which alarms were connected to monitoring systems and which ones just blinked a red light that nobody checked. He had designed the patrol route I followed every night, which meant he knew exactly where I would be and when I would be there. The lesson is this: if you work security, never follow the same route twice in the same way. Randomize everything: your timing, your entry points, the order in which you check buildings. The moment your patrol becomes predictable, it becomes avoidable. And if the person avoiding you is someone who used to do your job, they will know things about your building that you haven't learned yet. Change the locks when someone leaves. Revoke every key and every access code. Assume that anyone who had access yesterday still has it today until you have physically verified otherwise. Because the most dangerous security breach isn't the stranger who forces a door open from the outside. It's the familiar face who already has the key and knows exactly when you won't be looking. That is what keeps me checking locks twice, and it is why I will never follow someone else's patrol route again. The first time I heard the footsteps above the security office, I assumed it was the HVAC system. Old buildings make noise. Ductwork expands when the heat kicks on. Ceiling tiles settle. Pipes knock against their brackets when the water pressure changes. I had been working overnight security at Arden Ridge Mall in Sacramento for 5 months, and I had gotten used to the building talking to itself after midnight. But the HVAC doesn't walk in a straight line, and it doesn't stop when you stand up from your chair. My name is Donna. In the spring of 2024, I was 29 years old, living in a 2-bedroom apartment in the North Highlands neighborhood of Sacramento with my daughter, Lily, who was 4. North Highlands is the kind of place where people keep to themselves, not because they're unfriendly, but because everyone is working too hard to have time for conversation. The apartment complex sat behind a strip mall on Watt Avenue, across the street from a tire shop and a laundromat that was open 24 hours. I could hear the freeway from my bedroom if the windows were open, this low, constant hum that sounded like the city was idling. I'd been a single mom since Lily was 18 months old, when her father moved to Portland and gradually stopped calling. First, it was every other weekend, then once a month. Then the calls became texts, and the texts became nothing. By the time Lily turned 3, she had stopped asking about him entirely, and I had stopped expecting anything. I worked 2 jobs. During the day, I did accounts receivable for a plumbing supply company on Power Inn Road, a long industrial stretch on the east side of Sacramento lined with warehouses and wholesale distributors. 3 nights a week, Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday, I worked the overnight security shift at Arden Ridge Mall, a mid-sized shopping center on Arden Way between Watt Avenue and Eastern Avenue. The mall had been built in 1987, expanded in the mid-90s, and hadn't been significantly renovated since. It had a J.C. Penney, a Macy's, a food court, and about 80 smaller stores, a third of which were vacant. The kind of mall that was still technically open, but felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for the announcement that it was being turned into condominiums or a distribution center. The overnight security position paid $16 an hour, which was not great by Sacramento standards, but it was consistent work, and the schedule let me be home during the day with Lily while my mother watched her in the evenings. My shift ran from 10 at night to 6 in the morning. The mall closed to the public at 9. The last employees were usually out by 9:30. The cleaning crew came in at 9 and finished by midnight. After that, I was alone in approximately 600,000 square feet of retail space, connected by a central corridor that ran the full length of the building with 2 perpendicular wings branching off near the food court. The security office was on the ground floor, tucked between the management offices in a storage area behind the food court. It was a small room with a desk, a bank of 16 camera monitors, a radio, and a phone. The monitors showed feeds from cameras positioned at every entrance, the parking lot, the main corridors, the loading dock, and the anchor store entrances. The cameras were old, the kind that recorded to a DVR system in grainy resolution that made everyone look like they were moving through fog. But they worked, and they covered the main arteries of the building well enough. My patrol route was simple, 3 rounds per shift. I'd walk the main corridor end to end, check every exterior door, walk the food court, check the loading dock, and loop back through the anchor store entrances. Each round took about 45 minutes. Between rounds, I sat in the security office, watched the monitors, and studied for the real estate license exam I was trying to pass so I could eventually stop working 2 jobs and start working one that actually paid the bills. The HVAC system in the mall was industrial. Massive air handlers in the mechanical rooms on the roof, connected to ductwork that ran through the ceiling plenum, the space between the drop ceiling tiles, and the structural roof deck. In a building this size, the plenum was substantial. In some areas, particularly above the food court and the main corridor, there was 4 to 5 feet of clearance between the drop ceiling and the deck above. Enough room for the ductwork, electrical conduit, fire suppression plumbing, and not much else. Or so I thought. The footsteps started on a Tuesday in mid-March. I was in the security office at approximately 2:45 in the morning, reading a chapter on property disclosure laws and drinking my second cup of coffee from the vending machine in the break room when I heard it. A series of dull, rhythmic impacts directly above me. Not the metallic tick of expanding ductwork, not the random pop of a settling tile. This was deliberate, even, spaced like steps. It moved from one side of the ceiling to the other, maybe 20 feet, and then stopped. The silence that followed was heavier than the sound itself, the kind of silence where your ears strain so hard to hear something that you start inventing noise out of the static in your own head. I looked up. The ceiling was standard commercial drop tile, white 2x4 panels in an aluminum grid, the kind you see in every office and retail space in America. Nothing was visibly displaced, no sagging tiles, no dust falling. I set my coffee down and stood up from the chair, slowly, and the sound stopped immediately. Not gradually, immediately. Like whatever was making it knew I had moved. I stood there for a full minute, barely breathing, listening so hard my jaw ached from clenching. Nothing. I told myself it was a rat. Sacramento had rats. Every building this old had rats, especially around the food court where the dumpsters attracted every scavenger in a 2-block radius. A big rat in the ceiling plenum could make sounds that, at 2 in the morning in an empty building, your brain might interpret as footsteps. I heard it again the following Thursday. Same time, roughly between 2:30 and 3. Same pattern. Rhythmic, deliberate, traveling in a straight line above the security office. This time it went on for longer, maybe 30 seconds, and seemed to continue past the office wall into the area above the food court. I stood up and walked into the food court. The sound had stopped. I scanned the ceiling. 600 square feet of drop tiles in a grid, fluorescent light panels interspersed every 12 feet, all of them dark. I saw nothing, but I noticed something I hadn't noticed before. One of the ceiling tiles above the food court, near the wall between a shuttered pretzel stand and the entrance to the restroom corridor, was sitting slightly lower than the others. Not by much, maybe half an inch. But it was enough to catch my eye because I'd been staring at these ceilings for 5 months, and my brain had cataloged their patterns without me realizing it. That tile had been flush with the grid the last time I looked. Now it wasn't. I dragged a chair from the food court seating area, one of those heavy plastic chairs bolted to a metal frame, and positioned it directly under the displaced tile. I stood on it, and I could just reach the ceiling grid. I pushed the tile up with both hands and slid it to the side, opening a 2x4-foot window into the ceiling plenum. The air that came down smelled different from the mall air, stale and warm, with a faint organic undertone that I couldn't place, like old fabric or unwashed clothing. I turned on my flashlight and pointed it up. Ductwork, conduit, the gray underside of the roof deck, dust. A lot of dust, thick enough that you could see where it had been disturbed and where it hadn't, like fresh snow that someone had walked through. And in the dust on the top of the adjacent tile, I could see a mark. A long smear, like something had been dragged across the surface, or like someone had placed a hand flat against it while crawling past. The smear was about the width and length of a human palm. I reported it to my supervisor, a property manager named Victor, who handled the overnight operations remotely from an office in Roseville. Victor told me it was probably raccoons. Sacramento had raccoons too, and they were bigger than the rats. He said he'd send someone from maintenance to check the plenum access points and make sure nothing had gotten in through the roof. He didn't send anyone. The following Tuesday, I heard the footsteps again. This time I was ready. I sat still in the chair and listened. The sound started above the food court, traveled toward the security office, passed directly overhead, and continued into the area above the management offices. I timed it. The sound traveled approximately 60 feet in 45 seconds. That was a pace of roughly 1 step per second, which was a slow, careful walking speed. Not a rat, not a raccoon, not ductwork. I got up and walked to the management office corridor. There was a maintenance access panel in the ceiling at the end of the hallway, a hinged metal hatch that was supposed to be secured with a padlock. The padlock was there, hanging from the hasp, but it was unlocked. The hasp was unlatched. The access panel was closed, but not secured. Anyone could push it open from below and climb into the ceiling plenum using the metal shelving unit that sat directly underneath it. I opened the panel with a push. I shone my flashlight up into the space. The plenum above the management offices was wider than I expected, maybe 5 feet of clearance, with a concrete walking surface that had been poured as part of the original construction for maintenance access to the rooftop units. It was essentially a crawl space that ran the length of the building's central corridor, wide enough to walk through hunched over, with branches leading to the mechanical rooms above each wing. I didn't go up. I called Victor again. This time I was direct. I told him someone was in the ceiling. He was quiet for a long time, and then told me to lock the access panel, and he would call the Sacramento Police Department in the morning. I told him I was calling them now. He said that was my judgment call. I made the call. 2 officers from the Sacramento PD arrived at 3:40 in the morning. I met them at the loading dock entrance, which faced the back parking lot where the delivery trucks parked during the day. The lot was empty and lit by a single sodium vapor lamp that turned everything the color of old mustard. I walked them through the building to the management office corridor and showed them the access panel. One of them, a young officer named Reyes, who looked like he might have been 23 or 24, climbed up with a flashlight while his partner and I watched from below. His partner, an older woman whose name I don't remember, stood with one hand resting on her radio and her eyes on the ceiling, tracking the sound of Reyes moving through the plenum above us. Reyes was up there for about 10 minutes. When he came down, he lowered himself carefully through the hatch and stood on the shelving unit, and his expression had changed. The casual confidence he'd had walking into the building was gone. He told me he had found signs of habitation approximately 100 feet into the plenum, above the main corridor near the Macy's wing. A foam sleeping pad, a rolled blanket, empty water bottles, granola bar, and protein bar wrappers, a phone charger with a long extension cord that had been spliced into one of the electrical junction boxes in the ceiling, and a hand-drawn map, sketched on the back of a food court tray liner, showing the layout of the entire ceiling plenum, every access panel, every mechanical room, every branch corridor, every section where the clearance was high enough to move through comfortably. The map was detailed and accurate. Whoever drew it knew the building's infrastructure intimately. The officers searched the entire accessible plenum that night and found no one. Whoever had been living up there was not present. But based on the amount of accumulated trash and the wear patterns in the dust, they estimated the space had been occupied intermittently for several weeks, possibly longer. The Sacramento PD opened an investigation. They pulled mall employee records and cross-referenced them with anyone who had recently been terminated or had access to building maintenance areas. Within 3 days, they identified a person of interest. His name was Craig Tully. He was 41 years old and had worked as a maintenance technician at Arden Ridge Mall for 7 years before being fired 4 months earlier for repeated attendance violations. During his employment, Tully had been responsible for maintaining the HVAC systems, which meant he had spent thousands of hours in the ceiling plenum. He knew every inch of it. He knew which sections were wide enough to move through, which tiles could be lifted without disturbing the grid, and which electrical junction boxes could power a phone charger without tripping a breaker. Tully was arrested at a campsite along the American River Parkway, about 2 miles from the mall, 3 days after the police identified him. The parkway is a stretch of bike trail and open space that runs along the American River from downtown Sacramento out to Folsom. Homeless encampments had been a growing issue along the parkway for years, and Tully had set up a tent in a cluster of trees about 100 yards from the trail, not far from the Watt Avenue Bridge. When officers found him, he was sitting in a folding camp chair outside his tent, eating a can of soup. He didn't run. He had a backpack containing a change of clothes, a flashlight, a small battery-powered radio, and a key to the mall's maintenance access panel that he had copied before being fired. He admitted to entering the mall through the loading dock, which had a door with a known latch issue that maintenance staff had been complaining about for over a year, climbing into the ceiling plenum and spending nights there when the weather was bad or when he needed to charge his phone. He told the police he usually came in after midnight and left before 5. He said he had been doing it for about 2 months, though he wasn't sure of the exact timeline. He said he tried to be quiet, but that the ceiling tiles made it hard to move without making noise, especially in the older sections where the aluminum grid had loosened over the years and the tiles rocked slightly when you put weight on the adjacent support beams. The detail that stayed with me the longest was this. Tully told the police that he sometimes dropped down from the ceiling into closed stores after my patrol had passed. He knew my route. He had watched me through gaps in the ceiling tiles, tracking my flashlight as I walked the corridors below him. He knew which stores had accessible ceiling panels and which didn't. He knew I checked the exterior doors but never looked up. He had been watching me from 4 feet above my head, and I never knew. The mall replaced every lock on every maintenance access panel. They installed motion sensors in the plenum and added camera coverage to the loading dock and the management office corridor, 2 areas that had been blind spots since the system was originally installed. They repaired the loading dock door latch, which turned out to be a $15 part that could have been replaced at any point in the previous 14 months. Victor called me personally to apologize for not taking my initial reports more seriously and offered me a $2 an hour raise. I took the raise because I needed the money. But I put in my notice 3 weeks later and finished my real estate license that summer. I sell houses now in the Natomas area, north of downtown Sacramento. Lily is 6 and in 1st grade at a school 3 blocks from our apartment. I pick her up every afternoon, and we walk home together, and she tells me about her day in the breathless, detailed way that 6-year-olds do, where every event is equally important and nothing gets edited out. I make more money than I ever did working 2 jobs, and I sleep at night, which turns out to be something I had undervalued for most of my 20s. The thing I want people to take from this is simple. Look up. When you walk through a building, any building, look at the ceiling. Those tiles above your head are not solid walls. They are lightweight panels resting in a metal grid, and behind them is a space that can be 2 feet deep or 5 feet deep or more. In most commercial buildings, that space is accessible through maintenance hatches that may or may not be properly secured. If you work security, check those hatches. Check the locks. Look for displaced tiles, fresh dust marks, anything that suggests the ceiling has been disturbed. We are trained to watch doors and windows and hallways. We check the horizontal plane, because that is where we live and move. But buildings have a vertical dimension too, and the people who know that, the people who used to work in the spaces we never think about, can move through a building like ghosts. Craig Tully walked above my head for weeks, watched me through the gaps in the ceiling tiles, and tracked my movements like I was the one being monitored. The only reason I caught him is that old ceiling tiles aren't as quiet as he needed them to be. If the building had been newer, with tighter grids and better insulation, I might never have heard him at all. The first time I saw him, I didn't think anything of it. He was wearing the same navy coveralls as every other janitor in the building, pushing the same gray mop bucket, nodding the same tired nod that people give each other at 2 in the morning when neither of them wants to be awake. It wasn't until 3 weeks later, when I watched him walk through a door he shouldn't have been able to open, that I understood something was very wrong. My name is Marcus. In the fall of 2022, I was 22 years old, and in my last year at the University of Memphis studying criminal justice. I had big ideas about becoming an FBI agent someday, the kind of ideas you have when you're young enough to believe the world works the way it does in the textbooks. To pay rent on my apartment off Southern Avenue, I worked overnight security at the Brinkley Building, a 20-story office tower on South Main Street in downtown Memphis. The building had been renovated in 2018, all glass and polished concrete on the ground floor, but the upper floors still had that old Memphis feel to them. Drop ceilings, beige carpet, the faint smell of decades of coffee and copy toner baked into the walls. My shift ran from 10 at night to 6 in the morning. I'd park in the east garage, badge through the side entrance, and walk to the security desk in the lobby with my backpack full of textbooks and a thermos of coffee that I'd refilled from the break room on the 3rd floor around 2 in the morning. The building was mostly empty by 7 in the evening. By 8, the last few accountants and law clerks would trickle out, their footsteps echoing off the marble lobby floor. By the time I clocked in at 10, it was just me, the cleaning crew, and whoever forgot their laptop and came back to grab it from the parking garage. The cleaning company was called Mid-South Facility Services. They had a crew of 4 who came in at 9 and were usually done by 1 in the morning. I knew them by first name. Ray, who was in his 50s and always had earbuds in. Tasha, who was loud and funny and called me baby like I was her nephew. Kevin, who barely spoke but always waved. And Luis, their floor lead, who checked in with me at the start of every shift and signed the cleaning log when they finished. Downtown Memphis at night has a particular quality to it. South Main is one of the revitalized stretches, full of restaurants and galleries during the day, but after dark it gets quiet fast. You can hear the trolley tracks humming even when no trolley is running. The FedEx Forum sits a few blocks north, and on game nights, the noise would carry to the building, this muffled roar that would swell and fade. But most nights it was just the wind coming off the river and the occasional siren heading toward Methodist South. The building had a decent camera system, 16 cameras covering the lobby, the parking garage, the elevator banks on floors 1, 10, and 20, and the stairwell exits on every 5th floor. My job was to sit at the security desk in the lobby, monitor the feeds, do 2 walking patrols per shift, 1 at midnight and 1 at 4, and make sure nobody was in the building who shouldn't be. It was boring work. I studied during the dead hours, ate gas station food, and counted down the shifts until graduation. The man I would come to think of as the night janitor first appeared on a Tuesday in early October. I was doing my midnight patrol, walking the 10th floor, when I turned a corner near the elevator bank and saw a guy mopping the hallway outside a row of insurance offices. Navy coveralls, gray mop bucket, yellow wet floor sign already placed. He looked up when he heard my footsteps, gave me that tired nod, and went back to mopping. I nodded back and kept walking. I assumed he was a new guy on Luis's crew. People rotated in and out of janitorial work all the time. I didn't give it a second thought. I saw him again 2 nights later, this time on the 14th floor. Same coveralls, same bucket, same nod. He was wiping down the glass doors of an accounting firm. I noticed he was older than I'd first thought. maybe late 40s. Thin face, receding hairline, wire-rimmed glasses. He had an ID badge clipped to his coveralls, which was standard for the cleaning crew. I still didn't think anything was wrong. Over the next 2 weeks, I saw him maybe 5 or 6 times during my patrols, always on upper floors, always alone, always cleaning something. He never spoke to me, and I never spoke to him beyond the occasional nod. It was the most unremarkable thing in the world. A janitor in a building full of janitors. Then, one night in mid-October, I was reviewing camera footage as part of a routine check the building manager had asked me to do. There had been a complaint from a tenant on the 16th floor about items being moved on their desk overnight. Nothing stolen, just rearranged. A stapler in a different spot, a framed photo turned slightly, that sort of thing. The tenant assumed the cleaning crew had bumped things while dusting. The building manager wanted me to pull footage from that floor to confirm. I pulled up the 16th floor elevator camera from the previous night. I watched Luis and his crew arrive on that floor at around 11:15, clean for 45 minutes, and leave by midnight. Normal. Then, at 1:47 in the morning, well after the cleaning crew had finished and left the building, the elevator doors opened on 16, and a man stepped out. Navy coveralls, gray mop bucket, wire-rimmed glasses. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. I rewound the footage and watched it again. The man walked out of the elevator with his bucket and mop and turned left down the hallway, out of the camera's view. He moved with confidence, like he knew exactly where he was going and had been there many times before. I checked the lobby footage from the same night. I found him entering the building at 10:23, 23 minutes after I had started my shift. He came in through the parking garage entrance on the east side, a door that required a key card to open. He badged in like any employee would, walked through the garage, and took the service elevator to the upper floors. He didn't pass through the lobby at all. He knew how to avoid the main security desk entirely. I pulled footage from the nights before. I found him on 5 separate occasions over the previous 2 weeks, always entering between 10 and 11 at night, always through the parking garage. On 3 of those nights, he stayed in the building until 4 or 5 in the morning. He spent hours on the upper floors, moving between offices with what appeared to be a functioning key card that gave him access to individual suites. I sat at the security desk and watched that clip 4 times. Each time, the cold feeling got heavier. The man moved through the building like he had a floor plan memorized. He didn't hesitate at intersections. He didn't check door numbers. He walked with the kind of ease that comes from doing something so many times it becomes automatic, the way you walk through your own apartment in the dark without bumping into anything. I called Luis the next morning. I asked him if he'd brought on any new crew members recently. He said no. It had been the same 4 for 3 months. I described the man in the wire-rimmed glasses. Luis said he had never seen anyone matching that description, and he had been running the overnight crew at the Brinkley building for over a year. The man wasn't Mid-South Facility Services. He wasn't a janitor at all. I reported everything to my supervisor, a guy named Gerald who managed security for the building's property management company. Gerald told me not to confront the man if I saw him again. He said to call the police and let them handle it. He also said he was going to pull the access log from the parking garage keycard system to see which card the man was using. The access log showed that the card belonged to a woman named Patricia Dwyer, who worked as an office administrator on the 14th floor. When Gerald contacted Patricia, she said she had lost her keycard about 6 weeks earlier and had been issued a replacement. She assumed the old one had been deactivated. It hadn't. Someone in building management had forgotten to disable it, and the man had found it or stolen it and had been using it ever since. I worked my next 3 shifts in a state of focused alertness that I had never experienced before in that building. Every shadow in the hallway had weight to it, every distant sound, a door closing, the hum of the elevator, the click of the HVAC system cycling on, made me stop and listen. I did my patrols with my phone ready to dial 911, moving slowly and checking every corridor before I turned the corner. On the second night, a Wednesday, everything was quiet. I did both patrols and saw nothing. No one entered through the parking garage after the cleaning crew left. I checked every floor I could access, walking slower than usual, listening for anything out of place. The building creaked and settled the way old buildings do, the HVAC ducts ticking as they expanded and contracted, the elevators humming on their cables even when no one had called them. I told myself the man had seen the cameras and moved on to somewhere else. I almost believed it. On the third night, a Thursday, I was doing my midnight patrol on the 14th floor when I smelled something that didn't belong in an office building at 1 in the morning. It was food. Specifically, it was the warm, greasy smell of fast food, like someone had microwaved a burger in one of the break rooms. I followed the smell down the hallway to a small kitchen area shared by 3 office suites. The microwave was warm to the touch. There was a crumpled fast food wrapper in the trash can that hadn't been there during my earlier check. He was in the building right now. I backed out of the break room slowly, like the air itself might give me away if I moved too fast. I went back to the stairwell and descended to the lobby as quietly as I could, my sneakers barely touching each step. My hands were shaking when I picked up the desk phone and called Gerald. My voice was steady, but my leg was bouncing under the desk the entire time I talked to him. Gerald called the Memphis Police Department. 2 officers arrived within 12 minutes, which felt like 12 hours. I stood at the lobby doors watching the street, waiting for their headlights, the silence of the empty building pressing against my back like a physical weight. I let them in through the lobby and showed them the camera feeds. We could see the man on the 10th floor camera, sitting in an office chair behind a desk in one of the suites, eating from a takeout container like he was on his lunch break. The officers took the elevator to 10. I watched on the camera as they approached the suite. The man didn't run. He didn't even seem surprised. He set down his food, stood up slowly, and put his hands where they could see them. One of the officers later told me that the man didn't flinch when they entered the suite. He looked up from his food the way you'd look up if a coworker walked into the break room. No panic, no sudden movements. He cooperated fully, answered every question without hesitation, and gave his name as Dennis Falk, 47 years old, no fixed address. When they asked him how long he'd been coming to the building, he said he wasn't sure exactly. A while. He said it like he was trying to remember how long he'd had a gym membership. What came out in the following days was worse than I had imagined. Dennis Falk had been entering the Brinkley building for approximately 2 months. He had obtained Patricia Dwyer's lost key card from the parking garage, where she had dropped it near her car. He had purchased the Navy coveralls and cleaning supplies from a janitorial supply store on Lamar Avenue. He had studied the cleaning crew's schedule by watching them from the parking garage stairwell over several nights, learning when they arrived, what floors they cleaned, and when they left. He timed his own entry to overlap with their presence so that anyone who saw him would assume he was part of the crew. Once inside, he had access to dozens of offices on the upper floors. Most suite doors required individual key cards, but he had figured out which doors had been propped open or had malfunctioning locks. He spent his nights sitting at desks, using office computers that employees had left logged in, eating food from break room refrigerators, and sleeping on couches in conference rooms. He used the gym showers on the 3rd floor, which were part of a building amenity that didn't require a separate access card. He had been essentially living in the building, rotating between floors and suites to avoid establishing a pattern that anyone would notice. The police also found that Falk had done this before. He had been arrested the previous year for similar behavior at a medical office building in Germantown, a suburb east of Memphis. Before that, he had been found living in a church fellowship hall in Midtown after the congregation noticed food disappearing from their pantry. He was not violent. He had no history of threatening behavior. He had no outstanding warrants, no weapons, no drugs. What he had was a storage locker on the 4th floor of the Brinkley building that he had been using as a personal closet. Inside it, police found 3 sets of coveralls, a toiletry bag, a sleeping bag, a phone charger, and a stack of paperback novels. He had been living a quiet, invisible life inside a building full of people who never once questioned whether he was supposed to be there. He was, by every account, a man who had fallen through every crack the system had and had found that the easiest way to survive was to pretend he belonged in places where nobody would think to question a man in a uniform with a mop. I finished my shift that night and sat in my car in the parking garage for a long time before I drove home. I thought about all the nights I had walked past Dennis Falk in the hallway and nodded at him like he was just another part of the building. I thought about how easily a uniform and a mop bucket and a confident nod could make a person invisible. I had been studying criminal justice for 4 years, learning about surveillance and threat assessment and behavioral analysis, and a man had been living in my building for 2 months, and I had smiled at him in the hallway. The Brinkley building updated their security protocols after the incident. All key cards are now deactivated within 24 hours of being reported lost. The cleaning crew wears photo ID badges with holographic verification strips. The parking garage entrance requires a secondary PIN code in addition to the key card swipe. And every security guard who works the overnight shift is now required to verify the identity of every person they encounter during patrols, no matter how familiar they look. The tenants were not told the full story. Building management sent a memo about updated security procedures and left it at that. Patricia Dwyer, whose lost keycard had given Falk access to the entire building, told me she felt sick about it for weeks, even though it wasn't her fault. She said she kept imagining him sitting at her desk in the dark, going through her things, and she couldn't stop checking her office when she arrived in the morning, looking for signs that someone had been there. Gerald offered me a raise to stay on. I finished the semester and turned in my resignation the week after graduation. I got my criminal justice degree. I never applied to the FBI. The whole experience had changed the way I thought about security and observation, and how easily the systems we build can be walked through by someone who simply decides to act like they belong. I work in insurance investigations now, sitting at a desk in a well-lit office in East Memphis with normal business hours and a parking lot full of cars and people who are exactly who they say they are. I have never worked another overnight shift, and I don't intend to. Here's the thing I tell people when this story comes up. We are conditioned to trust uniforms. A man in coveralls with a mop bucket is invisible because we have already categorized him in our minds. He belongs. He is part of the scenery. We do the same thing with delivery drivers, cable technicians, maintenance workers, anyone wearing the visual shorthand of a job we recognize. And most of the time, that trust is perfectly reasonable. But the gap between most of the time and all of the time is exactly where people like Dennis Falk live. If you work in a building, any building, and you see someone you don't recognize, ask them who they are. Check their badge, call the front desk. It takes 10 seconds, and the worst that happens is you feel briefly awkward. The alternative is finding out 2 months later that someone has been sleeping in your conference room and reading your emails. Trust the uniform, but verify the person wearing it. That is the only lesson from those 2 months that I still carry with me every single day.